In the annals of ancient history, few stories capture the brutal intersection of honor and cruelty, quite like that of Marcus Atilius Regulus, a Roman general whose unwavering commitment to duty led him to one of the most horrific deaths ever recorded in antiquity. His execution by boiling oil remains a chilling testament to both human nobility and the depths of vengeful barbarism. The tale of Regulus unfolds during the First Punic War, a conflict that would shape the relationship between Rome and Carthage for generations to come. Born into the Roman aristocracy around 3007 BC, Marcus Atilius Regulus embodied the virtues most sacred to the Republic: courage, discipline, and an uncompromising sense of duty. These qualities elevated him to the heights of military glory, yet they also sealed his gruesome fate. In the 3rd century BC, Rome was an expanding power, hungry for dominance in the Mediterranean. Having already conquered much of the Italian peninsula, the city-state now set its sights on the wealthy North African territories held by Carthage, a maritime empire built on trade and naval supremacy that posed the greatest threat to Roman ambitions. The clash between these two civilizations was inevitable, and it unfolded with a brutality that shocked even the ancient world. The First Punic War, which began in 264 BC over control of Sicily, quickly escalated into a struggle for Mediterranean supremacy. Rome, traditionally a land-based power, was forced to build a navy from scratch to challenge Carthaginian dominance at sea. For more than 2 decades, the conflict consumed vast resources and countless lives. It was into this cauldron of war that Marcus Atilius Regulus stepped, securing his place in history through both triumph and unimaginable suffering. Regulus first gained prominence as consul in 267 BC, demonstrating the military acumen that would make him one of Rome's most celebrated commanders. His early campaigns against the Salentini in southern Italy showcased his tactical brilliance and earned him the respect of his soldiers and the Roman Senate alike. By the outbreak of the Punic Wars, he was already recognized as one of the Republic's finest military minds, a man whose very name inspired confidence in Roman hearts. The turning point of his career came in 256 BC, when Regulus was appointed consul for the 2nd time and entrusted with command of the Roman invasion of Africa. This bold strategy aimed to strike directly at Carthage by forcing the enemy to defend its homeland rather than continuing the costly and protracted siege warfare in Sicily. The plan required enormous courage and strategic vision, qualities Regulus possessed in abundance, yet little did he realize that this campaign would transform him from a conquering hero into a martyred legend. The Roman fleet that carried Regulus and his legions across the Mediterranean was one of the largest armadas ever assembled by the Republic, consisting of over 30 ships and 140,000 men, a staggering force that embodied Rome's commitment to total victory. The sight of this massive force approaching the African coast must have struck terror into the hearts of the Carthaginians, who had never before faced such a direct threat to their homeland, and for a brief moment it seemed that Roman audacity might achieve what cautious strategy had long failed to secure. The initial landing at Clupea was a resounding success, with Roman forces swiftly establishing a secure beachhead and advancing toward Carthage itself. Regulus proved himself not only a master of conventional warfare, but also of psychological operations, exploiting the shock of the invasion to its fullest advantage as Carthaginian forces, stunned by the Romans' boldness, retreated in disorder. The path to Carthage seemed wide open, and victory appeared to lie within reach. Yet, as the cruel mathematics of ancient warfare often dictated, triumph could collapse into catastrophe with startling swiftness. Regulus's early victories in Africa elevated him to legendary status among his troops, while in Rome his reputation soared as reports spread of his forces sweeping across the Carthaginian countryside, capturing cities and amassing vast quantities of treasure and slaves. The wealth of Africa, built over centuries of trade, now seemed to lie exposed before the Roman legions. Ancient sources describe caravans brimming with gold, ivory, and exotic goods, flowing steadily into Roman camps, a sight that must have felt like a dream come true for soldiers who had endured years of grinding warfare in Sicily. The psychological impact of Regulus's invasion was equally profound. For generations, Carthage had been the aggressor, sending armies and fleets to challenge Roman power. But now, for the first time, Carthaginian mothers could hear the ominous sound of Roman war horns echoing across their own fields. The city that had dominated Mediterranean trade for centuries suddenly found itself fighting for survival upon its own soil, a reversal of fortune that would later bear grave consequences for the Roman general who led the invasion. As Roman forces pressed toward the outskirts of Carthage, panic gripped the city, and the ruling council, confronted with the specter of siege and destruction, began to consider surrender. Envoys were dispatched to Regulus in hopes of negotiating a peace that might preserve their city and empire. At the very height of his triumph, however, Regulus made decisions that would echo through history and determine his destiny. His response to Carthaginian overtures revealed both the nobility and the fatal rigidity of the Roman character, for the terms he demanded were impossibly harsh. He insisted upon the complete surrender of Sicily and Sardinia, the payment of massive reparations, and the reduction of Carthage to little more than a Roman vassal state. Most humiliating of all, he required their fleet to be reduced to a handful of ships, effectively stripping Carthage of its status as a maritime power. These terms reflected not only Rome's ambitions, but also Regulus's personal conviction that total victory was within his grasp. The negotiations exposed the fundamental differences in how the two civilizations approached war and diplomacy. For the Carthaginians, war was an extension of business, costly but sometimes necessary for safeguarding trade, whereas for the Romans, war was a sacred test of national virtue and divine favor. Regulus, embodying this Roman worldview, could not imagine accepting anything short of complete submission from his foes. Yet this very inflexibility, while admirable in its consistency, proved to be his tragic miscalculation. Unbeknownst to Regulus, his moment of greatest strength was also the point of his deepest vulnerability. His army, though victorious, was far from home, stretched thin at the end of fragile supply lines, while the Carthaginians, recovering quickly from their initial defeats, were already preparing a response that would alter the war's course. Help was on the way in the form of Xanthippus, a seasoned Spartan mercenary whose unmatched military expertise would soon prove decisive in the confrontation to come. Xanthippus arrived in Carthage at the city's darkest hour, when its fall seemed inevitable and despair hung heavy over its people. A professional soldier trained in the unforgiving Spartan military tradition, he brought not only tactical brilliance, but also a clear-eyed assessment of the dire strategic situation. Unlike the Carthaginian generals who had repeatedly been outmaneuvered by Roman tactics, Xanthippus understood both the strengths and the vulnerabilities of the Roman military system, and his presence would transform a demoralized Carthaginian force into a disciplined and formidable army. His analysis was brutally honest. Carthaginian defeats, he argued, had not been the result of cowardice or lack of numbers, but of flawed tactical choices and the failure to exploit their natural advantages. The flat terrain around Carthage was ideal for cavalry maneuvers and elephant warfare, yet previous commanders had allowed the Romans to dictate battlefields that favored their infantry. To reverse this pattern, Xanthippus proposed a complete overhaul of Carthaginian strategy, one that capitalized on their strengths while targeting Roman weaknesses. Under his strict guidance, the Carthaginian army underwent intensive retraining. War elephants, those terrifying tanks of the ancient battlefield, were reintegrated into tactical formations with renewed purpose. The cavalry, drawn largely from Numidian tribes renowned for their unmatched horsemanship, received fresh training in coordinated charges, while demoralized infantry units had discipline restored to them through rigorous drills and Spartan methods. The transformation was swift and dramatic, turning a broken and defeated army into a cohesive and dangerous fighting force. Regulus, flush with confidence after a string of victories, failed to recognize the evolving nature of his enemy. Although intelligence reports warned that Carthaginian resistance was stiffening, he dismissed this as little more than desperation rather than evidence of improved leadership. His own men, enriched and emboldened by months of plunder and success, had begun to grow complacent. The harsh discipline that had fueled their initial triumphs gave way to a dangerous relaxation born of overconfidence. This misjudgment would prove fatal when the reorganized Carthaginian army finally marched to meet him. The Battle of Tunis in 25 BC would go down as one of the most dramatic reversals in the annals of military history. Regulus, who only weeks earlier had seemed poised to bring Carthage to its knees, suddenly found himself facing a professional army under a commander who understood Roman tactics better than most Romans did themselves. The battle opened with a thunderous cavalry charge that smashed into the Roman flanks before they could form their disciplined defensive formations. Xanthippus had chosen his battlefield with precision, forcing the Romans to fight on open ground where their infantry superiority meant little. Then came the war elephants, unleashed with devastating effect, crashing through Roman lines like living battering rams. For once, the famed Roman discipline, so effective in countless encounters, proved inadequate against this new tactical brilliance. As his army collapsed around him, Regulus revealed the same personal courage that had earned him a legendary reputation. Refusing to abandon the field, he stayed among his troops, desperately attempting to rally them even as defeat became inevitable. Ancient accounts describe him fighting with unmatched valor, his sword dripping with enemy blood as Carthaginian forces closed in from all sides. Only when he was utterly exhausted, his body weakened by wounds and fatigue, was he finally overwhelmed and captured, setting into motion the chain of events that would lead to his legendary and tragic death. The aftermath of the Battle of Tunis was nothing short of catastrophic for Roman arms. Of the massive army that had landed in Africa with such high hopes, only a scattered handful managed to escape back to Sicily, while the majority were either slain on the battlefield or taken captive, marking one of the worst military disasters in Rome's long history. For the few survivors, the haunting memory of witnessing their seemingly invincible general dragged away in chains would never fade, etched into their minds as a symbol of despair and humiliation. Yet as devastating as the defeat had been, it would pale in comparison to the horrors awaiting Marcus Atilius Regulus in Carthaginian captivity. With his capture, Regulus was transformed from a fearsome military commander into a priceless political asset. For the Carthaginians realized that possessing such a renowned Roman general gave them a leverage that sheer battlefield victory could not achieve. Here was a man who had served as consul twice, whose voice carried weight in the Senate, and whose very name had become synonymous with Roman military virtue. His fate was no longer his own, but bound up with the larger diplomatic and strategic currents that would shape the course of the ongoing war. At first, the conditions of his captivity were relatively humane, reflecting his immense value as a bargaining chip. He was treated in a manner befitting his rank and status, allowed a degree of comfort, for the Carthaginians understood well that his usefulness lay not in torment, but in his potential influence over Roman policy. Thus, for several years, Regulus remained in this state of honorable imprisonment, a living reminder of Carthaginian triumph and Roman vulnerability. Neither he nor his captors could have anticipated the extraordinary chain of events that would lead to his brief release and set the stage for his ultimate fate. During these years of captivity, Regulus became more than a prisoner. He became a symbol of Roman resilience in the face of adversity. Tales of his unbroken dignity and steadfast refusal to abandon Roman principles spread across the Republic, inspiring soldiers and citizens alike. He came to embody the ideal Roman aristocrat, one who placed duty above personal safety, country above comfort, and principle above survival. This reputation would become crucial when the Carthaginians resolved to use their distinguished captive for a new diplomatic maneuver. Meanwhile, the war itself raged on with fluctuating fortunes. Roman naval victories provided some relief from the sting of land defeats, while Carthaginian resilience and tactical adaptability thwarted Rome's hopes for a swift and decisive end. As the years dragged into decades, both sides found themselves worn down by staggering costs in blood and treasure. The fiery enthusiasm with which the conflict had begun gave way to grim determination, and even that determination began to weaken as exhaustion spread through both nations. It was in this climate of mutual fatigue that the Carthaginian government conceived a daring gambit, one that would forever entwine the name of Marcus Atilius Regulus with one of history's most extraordinary displays of moral courage and its terrible price. By 250 BC, the First Punic War had raged for more than a decade with no resolution in sight. Both Rome and Carthage, battered and weary, began to consider the possibility of negotiation. The Carthaginian proposal was at once ingenious and cynical. They would temporarily release Regulus and send him to Rome as an emissary to present their peace terms to the Senate. The arrangement seemed deceptively straightforward. If he secured favorable conditions for Carthage, he would regain his freedom, returning at last to his family and his life of honor. But there was one binding condition. Regulus was required to swear a sacred oath that if the negotiations failed, he would return voluntarily to Carthage, surrendering himself once more to his captor. Such an oath was no mere formality in the ancient world. It carried immense weight, for to break it was not only to dishonor oneself, but to offend the gods, a crime more fearful than death itself. To the Romans, oaths were not mere words, but sacred bonds that tied a man's honor to his word and linked human affairs to the will of the gods. Breaking such a pledge was unthinkable, for it was not only a betrayal of one's captors, but also a violation of the divine order, an act that invited punishment not just upon the offender, but upon his family and descendants for generations. By requiring Marcus Atilius Regulus to swear such an oath, the Carthaginians believed they had forged an unbreakable chain that would bind him to their will and ensure his cooperation. Regulus, however, accepted the terms without hesitation, though his true motivations remain a subject of historical debate. Some accounts suggest he fully intended to honor the agreement and fulfill his mission exactly as his captors desired, while others claim he had already resolved to sacrifice himself for the good of Rome, viewing this temporary freedom as a final chance to serve his country. Whatever his inner thoughts may have been, his outward composure betrayed nothing, and he carried himself with the dignity of a man who understood that history itself was watching. The journey from Carthage back to Rome must have been both exhilarating and bittersweet for the former consul. After years of confinement, he was once again breathing the free air of Italy, seeing the familiar hills, fields, and towns of his homeland, each scarred by years of conflict, but still alive with the spirit he had fought to defend. As his ship approached the Roman harbor, word of his return had already spread, and crowds gathered in awe to witness what seemed almost miraculous: the reappearance of a general many had long presumed dead. The emotional reunion with his family was tempered by the knowledge that his freedom might be only an interlude. His wife Marcia and their children, who had endured years of agonizing uncertainty, now beheld him alive, yet still bound by the oath that demanded he return to captivity should negotiations fail. What was said in those private conversations between Regulus and his loved ones during those brief days in Rome will never be known, but one can imagine them filled with a mix of joy, grief, and a terrible foreboding of what was to come. Meanwhile, his presence ignited Rome with speculation and debate. Citizens whispered in the streets about what his mission meant. Did it signal Carthaginian weakness and desperation, or was it a sign of renewed strength? In the Senate, anticipation built to a fever pitch as preparations were made to hear from a man who had once stood in that very chamber to proclaim victories and guide policy. Now he would speak again, but this time as a prisoner temporarily freed, his words carrying a weight unlike any speech Rome had ever heard. When Regulus finally entered the Senate chamber, he faced men who had been his peers, comrades, and rivals for decades. These were senators who had celebrated his triumphs, mourned his capture, and who now looked to him with a mix of hope and uncertainty. The weight of their expectations, combined with his own uncompromising sense of duty, created a moment of immense historical drama. a moment that would echo through centuries as a lesson in courage and sacrifice. When Regulus addressed the Senate, he shattered Carthaginian hopes and stunned his Roman colleagues with one of the most extraordinary speeches in history. Rather than urging acceptance of the Carthaginian peace terms as his captors had intended, he rose and spoke with fiery conviction about the necessity of continuing the war. He warned that the terms offered by Carthage were intolerable, that they would sap Rome's strength, diminish its honor, and leave it vulnerable to further attacks. His words carried unparalleled authority, not only because of his vast military experience, which lent weight to his strategic insights, but also because of the immense personal cost behind them. Everyone in that chamber knew that by rejecting peace, Regulus was condemning himself to return to his enemies and to whatever fate they might devise for him. Yet he spoke with unwavering clarity, insisting that to accept such terms would be nothing less than surrender, a cowardly trade of temporary relief for permanent subjugation. He painted for the senators a vivid and terrifying picture of what Roman defeat would mean: the loss of Sicily, the crushing burden of tribute payments, and the reduction of the proud republic to a second-rate power. In that moment, Regulus stood not only as a general and a statesman, but as the living embodiment of Roman virtue, choosing honor, duty, and the survival of his country over his own life. The Senate listened in stunned silence as their former colleagues stood before them, arguing not for mercy or survival, but for his own death sentence. The once revered general laid out a brutally realistic analysis of the strategic situation, asserting that Carthage's willingness to negotiate was not a sign of strength, but of weakness, born from the desperation of an empire strained under the costs of prolonged warfare. Rome, he declared, was in a far stronger position than appearances suggested, and with proper leadership and sustained determination, ultimate victory was within reach. His conclusion was clear and uncompromising: the war must continue, no matter the personal cost. As Regulus's words echoed through the chamber, the implications became stark. By urging the rejection of peace terms, he was sealing his own fate, for his oath bound him to return to Carthage, where a betrayed enemy awaited his inevitable execution. The Senate sat paralyzed, caught between admiration and dread, grappling with the unbearable paradox that to heed sound advice meant consigning its giver to certain death. Their reaction revealed the eternal Roman struggle between political pragmatism and moral principle, as senators, deeply moved by Regulus's courage and persuaded by his arguments, recoiled at the horrific consequences of following them. Some suggested keeping him in Rome by claiming he had never been lawfully released from Roman custody, while others proposed altering his oath or exploiting legal loopholes that could free him from its grip. But Regulus rejected every attempt to spare him, insisting that an oath even to enemies was sacred, and that breaking it would dishonor not only him but Rome itself, whose reputation and credibility depended on the sanctity of its word. His unyielding devotion to honor, while noble, reflected the same tragic rigidity that had marked his career, elevating principle above survival, conviction above compromise. The Senate's debate stretched over days, with factions pulling in different directions. Some argued that Rome's survival required keeping him alive, while others countered that his sacrifice was essential to maintain Rome's integrity and divine favor. This bitter dispute exposed profound philosophical divisions about duty, honor, and expediency in politics. At last, the Senate voted to follow Regulus's counsel, rejecting Carthage's peace and accepting the terrible cost of their decision. The vote was far from unanimous, and the emotional storm it unleashed became one of the most poignant episodes in Roman legislative history, with senators weeping openly as they condemned their comrade to torture and death, recognizing that in his sacrifice lay the very virtues that made Rome formidable. As preparations began for his departure, the Roman people confronted the agonizing reality of his choice, gathering in vast crowds outside his home, imploring him to stay, insisting that promises made under duress were void, and urging that his duty to Rome outweighed obligations to his captors. Their pleas were desperate but powerless against his iron resolve. In the days that followed, Rome witnessed an unprecedented outpouring of collective grief, as citizens who had never met him felt bound to his plight, seeing in his decision the embodiment of the ideals that defined their civilization. His story inspired poems, songs, and philosophical debates, transforming him into a new kind of Roman hero, one whose greatest triumph lay not on the battlefield, but in the acceptance of his own destruction. For his family, the days of farewell were an unbearable trial, as they prepared to let go of a man who chose to walk, unwavering and unflinching, toward certain death, leaving behind a legacy that would resonate through Rome's history as the paradox of victory found in sacrifice. His wife, Marcia, would later earn fame for her own response to his murder, but in these final days, her role was one of quiet strength, standing by her husband's decision while carrying the grief of its consequences, and their children, still too young to grasp the magnitude of events, would spend their lives bearing the weight of their father's legendary sacrifice. When the day of departure came, Rome itself seemed to mourn, as crowds filled the roads to witness Regulus's last journey as a free man, an atmosphere of solemnity hanging over the procession as though they were watching the funeral of a man still alive. Regulus carried himself with the calm dignity befitting a former consul, but the sight of him willingly walking back into captivity and certain death stirred tears, even from his political enemies, cementing the moment in Roman memory as one of the defining episodes of the Republic's moral history. The voyage back to Carthage afforded him time to reflect on his choice, the irony of his fate surely evident to him, a man sailing toward death precisely because he had served his country with such uncompromising loyalty. Surrounded by Carthaginian guards, who were slowly realizing the magnitude of his betrayal, he preserved the composure that had marked his entire career, even as the coastline of Africa rose on the horizon, the last view he would ever behold as a free man. The city that he had nearly conquered now stood before him as the stage for his final ordeal, and the very leaders who had arranged his diplomatic mission would soon learn the fatal flaw in their plan. They had assumed that Regulus's love of life would outweigh his loyalty, but instead he had turned their strategy against them, delivering to Rome the news of Carthage's desperation and advising continued war. The Senate's rejection of peace, carried in the voice of their own messenger, struck Carthage like a physical blow, transforming their clever gamble into humiliating failure. They had released their most valuable prisoner only to see him return with the confirmation of their defeat in negotiation, and now someone had to pay for this disaster. Regulus's return marked the transition from imprisonment to execution, as his captors, no longer mere jailers, were now charged with turning him into a symbol, an example carved in flesh of the price of defying Carthage. His torture was not an act of spontaneous vengeance, but a deliberate political decision, crafted to resonate far beyond the walls of the city. By destroying Regulus with calculated cruelty, Carthage intended to send a message not only to Rome, but to its own citizens and allies. Betrayal, even from a prisoner bound by oath, would be met with punishment so horrific that no one would dare repeat it. Thus Regulus was destined to become a cautionary tale, his suffering weaponized as a tool of statecraft, his death a theater of cruelty designed to echo across the Mediterranean. The careful planning of his execution reflected the darkest extremes of ancient warfare, where spectacle mattered as much as outcome, and rather than granting him the mercy of a swift death, his captors orchestrated a slow descent into agony, each phase calculated to prolong life, maximize pain, and ensure his torment was both public and unforgettable. They wanted his cries to reverberate through Carthage and beyond, a living testament to Carthaginian vengeance. The first stage of this calculated torment was psychological, systematic sleep deprivation, an ancient but effective form of torture in which Regulus was kept awake for days by relentless light and sound. Though it left no marks on his body, the method devastated both his physical strength and mental stability, stripping away his capacity to resist, while beginning the slow unraveling of the man whose unbending honor had already defied his captors once before. The goal was to reduce the proud Roman general to a broken shell of his former self, and sleep deprivation was only the opening move in a campaign of calculated degradation, relentless exposure to intense light, both kept him from rest and inflicted physical damage, as his captors reportedly used polished metal mirrors to concentrate sunlight into his face, producing crippling headaches and beginning the slow destruction of his vision in a manner that was as psychologically shattering as it was physically harmful. From there, the cruelty escalated into mutilation. His eyelids removed in a procedure performed without anesthesia by executioners who ensured he remained conscious, so that sleep became impossible, and the North African sun itself served as an unending instrument of torment. Each dawn renewed searing pain, and each sunset offered only fleeting respite as his sight rapidly deteriorated, and the terror of impending blindness joined the other endless agonies. Even more diabolical was the invention of the spiked box, a cramped, spike-lined container that forced him into impossible stillness, punishing every involuntary twitch and reflex by driving sharp points into his flesh, wounds that festered in the confined space. This device turned the mechanics of being human muscle cramps, the need to shift, the act of breathing into sources of constant injury, transforming his own body into a perpetually betraying enemy and producing a claustrophobic terror that amplified the physical suffering. Yet ancient accounts insist that his spirit, though his body deteriorated, remained defiantly intact, and his captors, maddened by their inability to break his courage, resolved on a final public act of vengeance, so horrific that it would dwarf earlier displays of Carthaginian force. The decision to boil him alive in oil was not a fit of passion, but the deliberate choice of a climax that fused maximum physical torment with potent symbolic meaning, associated with wealth and ritual purification, would be harnessed both to punish and to ritually expiate the humiliation he had inflicted. Preparations for this ceremony of cruelty were meticulous. A large bronze cauldron calculated to hold a human body while remaining visible to an assembled crowd was specially commissioned, the bronze itself signifying Carthaginian wealth and technological prowess, so that the instrument of death also proclaimed the state's power. The selection of oil as the medium served practical and rhetorical ends. Its slow heating and long heat retention guaranteed a prolonged ascent of suffering as the temperature rose gradually, so that the execution would function as both a demonstration of dominion and a ritualistic cleansing, ensuring that Regulus's end would be seared into the memory of all who witnessed it. The viscous nature of hot oil clung to flesh, intensifying burns and making escape impossible even if the victim somehow slipped his restraints, while symbolically the oil represented both purification and transformation, a ritual through which Carthage could cleanse itself of the humiliation Regulus had inflicted. The authorities understood that spectacle was as important as punishment, and so they proclaimed the execution throughout the city, ensuring that it would be witnessed not only by citizens but also by foreign observers, Rome's representatives among them, for this death was intended as both mass entertainment and a message of deterrence to potential enemies. The crowd that assembled was a cross-section of Carthaginian society and the wider Mediterranean world, citizens eager for vengeance, merchants who had closed their shops, soldiers contemplating their own fates, and diplomats quietly recording every detail for their governments. The sheer diversity of the audience guaranteed that news of this spectacle would spread swiftly beyond Carthage's walls, multiplying its psychological force across the ancient world. When Regulus was finally brought before them, his body told the story of the prolonged torments he had endured. Scarred, broken, diminished, yet accounts insist that he retained the composure of a Roman magistrate, dignified even at the edge of death. And this final exhibition of courage only magnified the moral weight of what was about to unfold. The mechanics of the execution were as deliberate as the tortures that had preceded it. Suspended above the bronze cauldron by ropes and pulleys, his descent into the bubbling oil was carefully controlled, transformed into a grotesque performance where the executioners acted as stage managers of death. As the cauldron steamed and hissed, the crowd's voices faltered into silence, subdued by the enormity of what they were about to witness, the acrid smell of heating oil filling the air, thick with dread. The first touch of boiling liquid against Regulus's feet made audible the sizzling of flesh, and his involuntary cry silenced even the most bloodthirsty spectators. What many had anticipated as brutal entertainment suddenly revealed itself as a horrifying revelation of humanity's capacity for cruelty. Lowered inch by inch, his screams echoed through the streets, reverberating off stone walls until the whole city seemed to resound with his agony, an acoustic monument to suffering that would sear itself into memory. The oil, heated to extremes that destroyed flesh, instantly began its work, consuming the man who had once been Rome's greatest general, and though his captors had planned a lingering ordeal, the body's rapid shock and collapse into unconsciousness shortened the conscious part of his torment. This small mercy, unplanned and unintentional, could not blunt the terrible effect of the spectacle. When it was over, when the cauldron held nothing but the remains of Rome's envoy, the silence that settled over the crowd was heavier than any roar of triumph. Slowly they dispersed, shaken, disturbed, each bearing the indelible mark of what they had seen. The Carthaginians had eliminated their prisoner and made their statement, but they had also created something larger and more dangerous, a legend of martyrdom that Rome would carry forward, transforming Regulus's death into a moral weapon, a story of unyielding honor and cruel vengeance that would echo for generations, fueling the fires of Roman resolve against their enemies. News of Regulus's death reached Rome within weeks, carried by traders and diplomats who had borne witness to the execution, and the grisly details of his torture and end spread rapidly by word of mouth, losing nothing in transmission. In fact, each retelling grew more vivid, ensuring that every Roman citizen came to know exactly what their enemies were capable of. The psychological effect on Roman society was immense and enduring, and the Senate, which had once agonized over the moral complexity of honoring his sacrifice, now faced no such dilemma, for the manner of his death had transformed him from a noble martyr into a rallying cry for vengeance. His widow, Marcia, became the living embodiment of this fury, taking custody of Carthaginian prisoners and subjecting them to torments that mirrored those inflicted upon her husband, confining them in spiked boxes, denying them sleep, and exposing them to the elements, thereby inaugurating a cycle of atrocity that would define the remainder of the Punic Wars. Her actions, though understandable in their grief and rage, revealed how cruelty begets cruelty, escalating into a spiral of violence that consumed thousands more lives. With his death, the transformation of Regulus from general to legendary martyr was complete, and Roman orators and poets seized upon his sacrifice as the perfect model of Roman virtue, holding up his willingness to honor his oath, even at the cost of his life, as a standard against which future acts of courage would be measured. Death had granted him an immortality that life could never have provided, and the cult of Regulus that flourished in the years after his death served profound psychological and political purposes. His story gave Romans a moral framework for grappling with the costs of honor and duty, and his martyrdom justified the enormous sacrifices demanded by a war that seemed endless, offering proof that some principles were indeed worth dying for. Beyond Rome, his story spread throughout the Mediterranean, shaping how foreign nations perceived Roman civilized for enemies and allies alike, came to recognize that Romans would uphold their commitments regardless of personal cost, a lesson in steadfastness that influenced diplomacy and warfare for centuries. While the historical accuracy of certain tortures has been questioned by later scholars, some details perhaps embellished by storytellers and historians, such as Livy and Polybius, the essential facts of his capture, mission, and execution remain well attested, and the story's endurance reveals how deeply it resonated with Roman values and the broader truths of human nature. The legacy of Marcus Atilius Regulus far outlived the Punic Wars, echoing through literature, philosophy, and political thought for over 2 millennia. Cited by medieval chroniclers, Renaissance humanists, and modern political theorists alike as a timeless example of principled leadership, moral courage, and the high cost of honor. The tension between personal survival and public duty that the case of Regulus exemplifies remains strikingly relevant to contemporary discussions of ethics and leadership. For perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his story is not merely the cruelty of his execution, but the calculated and deliberate nature of the torture that preceded it. His captors were not driven by impulsive rage or uncontrolled passion, but instead carried out a carefully orchestrated program of psychological and physical torment, employing methods such as sleep deprivation, sensory assault, and psychological manipulation that would be instantly recognizable to modern students of interrogation and torture techniques. This continuity across millennia highlights a grim truth that systematic cruelty is not the unique product of any one culture or historical moment, but a dark and persistent constant within human nature, with only the tools and technologies of inflicting suffering evolving while the underlying psychology remains unchanged. The political dimensions of Regulus's torture and execution further underscore its significance. His executioners were not sadists indulging in personal pleasure, but officials following what they regarded as sound policy, calculating that the spectacle of his suffering would advance Carthaginian political and military objectives by warning both domestic audiences and foreign powers of the price of defiance. In this, they were employing cruelty as a political instrument, a strategy repeated countless times in history. The international reaction to Regulus's execution reveals the complex moral calculus of interstate relations, for while Roman outrage was heartfelt and immediate, other Mediterranean states assessed the event largely through the lens of their own strategic interests, with some interpreting it as evidence of Carthaginian strength deserving of respect, while others condemned it as barbarism that could justify future opposition to Carthage. The moral meaning of the act was overshadowed by its political utility. Equally important was the role of spectacle, for the gathered crowd was not simply passive witnesses to the execution, but participants in a carefully staged political theater, their reactions destined to echo across the Mediterranean and amplify the intended message of Carthaginian dominance. The executioners understood that the true impact of their act depended as much upon what the witnesses saw and reported as upon the physical suffering of Regulus himself. Even the technical aspects of the execution, such as the construction of a special cauldron, the preparation of boiling oil, and the design of the pulley system, demonstrated that substantial resources were deliberately invested to ensure the death achieved maximum symbolic and psychological effect. This degree of preparation revealed that Regulus's execution was regarded not as mere vengeance, but as a calculated investment in Carthaginian prestige. The medical horrors of death by boiling oil, too gruesome to describe in detail, explain why this method was chosen, for the slow, visible and audible nature of the victim's agony guaranteed a searing impression upon all who witnessed it. Beyond the physical destruction of Regulus's body, the execution symbolized the total annihilation awaiting Carthage's enemies, operating simultaneously on personal, political and symbolic levels. Yet the aftermath of this carefully planned spectacle demonstrated the ultimate limits of terror as a political weapon, for instead of intimidating Rome into submission, the cruel death of Regulus galvanized Roman resistance, hardening their resolve and providing powerful motivation for the continuation of the Punic War. The Carthaginians, in their calculated cruelty, had inadvertently created a martyr whose story would inspire their enemies for generations, achieving the opposite of their intended effect, and illustrating the unpredictable nature of psychological warfare, as well as the danger of underestimating enemy morale. The cycle of vengeance that followed Regulus's death set a precedent for the escalating brutality that came to define the later Punic Wars. For Marcia's revenge on Carthaginian prisoners proved that Romans too were capable of systematic cruelty when provoked, thereby normalizing torture and atrocity as acceptable instruments of warfare and contributing to a hardening of military culture whose consequences would echo across both civilizations. The transformation of Regulus into a legendary figure was not only facilitated by the horrifying drama of his death, but also reflected deeper Roman cultural ideals surrounding honor, duty, and sacrifice. For his willingness to endure unimaginable torment while remaining true to his principles made him a perfect exemplar of the virtues that Romans believed distinguished them from their enemies. His martyrdom, serving equally as moral compass and propaganda tool, was amplified through the literary and artistic works of poets like Horace and historians like Livy, who wove his example into explorations of patriotism, duty, and moral courage that resonated deeply with their audiences. These retellings ensured that his story outlived the Republic, the Empire, and the fall of Rome itself, continuing to shape Western culture for millennia. The resonance of Regulus's sacrifice extended beyond antiquity, as scholars and political theorists repeatedly drew parallels between his choice and the martyrdom of religious figures, the defiance of resistance fighters, and the sacrifices of modern political prisoners, suggesting that his story expresses universal human struggles that transcend time and context. Yet debate over the wisdom of his choice endures, with some arguing that his death served no practical purpose and that duty to family should have outweighed abstract principle, while others contend that his refusal to compromise provided vital moral leadership at a moment when Rome most needed inspiration. This ongoing discourse underscores the ethical complexity his case represents. Militarily, Regulus's death carried consequences far beyond its immediate psychological shock, for his martyrdom helped sustain Roman morale during the grueling years that followed. While his earlier advice to reject Carthaginian peace overtures proved strategically sound when Rome eventually triumphed in the First Punic War, vindicating his judgment about Carthaginian fragility and Roman resilience. Thus, his death served not only as a symbol, but as a practical pillar of ultimate victory. The careful documentation of Regulus's story by multiple ancient historians, including Polybius, who relied on eyewitness testimony, demonstrates how exceptional his case appeared even to contemporaries. For educated opinion, recognized in his life and death, an emblematic tale of the cultural and political themes that defined the titanic struggle between Rome and Carthage. The influence of Regulus's example on Roman military culture was both profound and enduring, for his story became a fixture in the education of young aristocrats preparing for military and political careers, serving as both inspiration and warning about the heavy costs of leadership. The expectation that Roman commanders would emulate his courage and integrity became woven into the cultural fabric of the Republic's military traditions, shaping the ethos of an entire civilization. Beyond Rome's borders, the international reputation forged by Regulus's sacrifice produced diplomatic advantages that extended long after the Punic Wars, for other nations learned that Romans would honor their commitments even at tremendous personal cost, which made them more trustworthy allies and more formidable enemies. This reputation for steadfastness evolved into a vital form of Roman soft power, influencing political dynamics throughout the Mediterranean world. Yet the modern relevance of Regulus's story lies not in the specifics of ancient warfare, but in the timeless questions it provokes about leadership, integrity, and the relationship between private survival and public duty. For this reason, his case continues to be studied in military academies and leadership programs as a model of principled decision-making under extreme pressure, and the moral complexity of his choices ensures that his story remains a cornerstone of contemporary debates on ethics and responsibility. In the end, the horrifying execution of Marcus Atilius Regulus stands as one of history's most striking illustrations of the tension between human cruelty and human nobility. Though his torturers destroyed his body, they failed to break his spirit or diminish his legacy. By choosing to honor his oath in full knowledge of the consequences, he elevated himself from a defeated Roman general into an eternal symbol of moral courage. His death, intended as a demonstration of Carthaginian power, became instead an immortal testament to the strength of principled conviction, and his legacy still resonates more than 2 millennia later, reminding us both of the principles worth dying for and of the capacity for cruelty that lurks within human nature. In a modern world where the struggle between pragmatism and principle remains unresolved, the story of Marcus Atilius Regulus endures as inspiration and warning alike, a reminder that the decisions made in moments of crisis define not only who we are, but who we ultimately choose to become.